Today we will be reading John chapter 7, verses 1 to 31. You can follow along in your Bibles, reading on the screen, or if you're at home, there's a link in the description. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea, because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand, so his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For not even his brothers believed in him. Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come." After saying this, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. The Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, "Where is he?" And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said, "He is a good man," others said, "No, he is leading the people astray." Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, "How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?" So Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps it. Why do you seek to kill me?" The crowd answered, "You have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you?" Jesus answered them, "I did one work, and you all marveled at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." Some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, "Is this not the man whom they seek to kill? And here he is, speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Christ? But we know where this man comes from, and when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from." So Jesus proclaimed, as he taught in the temple, "You know me, and you know where I come from, but I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me." So they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him, because his hour had not yet come. Yet many of the people believed in him. They said, "When the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done?" This is the word of our Lord.
Most often, we trust the person that we listen to. Or to put another way, we listen to the person we trust. And one of the most difficult things that we see in our society and in our lives right now, no matter who you are, where you're coming from right now, is we have a crisis of trust. Every institution, every sort of entity that in the past would have been the places of authority, the people that we would trust, whether it was government officials, whether it was the church, whether it was the family, parents, and so on, all these people who, in a sense, were the places that you look to for truth, the people that you look to hear what you needed to hear. They were the authorities. They were the people that you trusted. They were the people that you would listen to. All of them have basically been undermined and left to a place where our world now says, you can trust no one. Trust no institution. Don't trust the government. Don't trust the media. Don't trust the church. Don't trust your family. Don't trust anybody. The only person left to trust in our culture today is me. It's just me. And that's what we're told over and over again. If you're willing to listen and pay attention to it, you'll hear the message of our world today right now is the final authority in your life ought to be, should be you, me, the individual. That we are the final authority of what is right and what's wrong, of what we should or shouldn't be in life, of how we should or shouldn't act, of what our true identity ought to be. That's all based on our thinking, our own feelings, our own desires. That is the final authority. And don't, as the world says, don't let anybody tell you differently. Just listen ultimately to yourself. Now, there's a rather ironic thing that sort of comes alongside this in our culture today, and I want to point it out to you if you haven't seen it yet, and that's this. The individual is now the final authority, not the church, not the government, not anybody else, not your family. You're the final authority. But there's still this deep-rooted desire in people to say, this is who I am, this is what I've decided I'm going to be, this is my true identity, and I want you to affirm me. I want you to approve of what I say, no matter what it is. No matter what I decide, no matter what I choose, your job community, your job family, your job people around me is to say yes to whatever I choose for myself. It's rather ironic, actually. If I'm the final authority, if what I want and what I desire is the final authority and no one has a right to tell me what or what not to do or what not to be, why do I need affirmation from anybody else? Why does it matter? And the difficult thing that's actually happening in our culture more and more today is that while this is happening and people are demanding this affirmation, we are running into the problem over and over again of who's going to decide what affirmation to give, when, and to whom. You see, here's the problem when we begin to structure our society like this, and it's happening whether you like it or not, is that you end up in a place where people are craving affirmation for their own individual desires, but no one can say what those individual desires ought to be other than the individual, his or herself. And you might say, well, what is this need for affirmation in us? Where does this come from? And this is where it's interesting to me, and that is this desire for people to affirm what we decide for ourselves comes from the deeper desire in us to belong. The deeper desire in our hearts and our lives to be loved. We want people to affirm our thinking and our feeling and our desires because we long for people around us to say, yes, you matter. Yes, you belong. Yes, I love you. And the problem is that what we're doing right now isn't working. Because when every person decides for themselves what their final authority is, what their identity is, what their sense of right and wrong is, all you end up with is chaos. And it's into this context today that our passage is such an amazing passage for us to hear. Because in one sense, Christianity comes to us in our culture today, words from 2,000 years ago that Jesus speaks, and it begins to confront us in the fact that this isn't really super new. I mean, it's new in a certain way, but it's not new. And it's not new because as we look through this passage, there's two big things I want to show you today, and I hope we can see them together, and that's this. It shows us at least three groups or sort of collection of people who are busy listening to themselves and where that leads. And then it shows us that there's actually someone who's much greater, much more loving, much more wonderful, much more trustworthy, who we ought to listen to. Someone outside of ourselves. And when you see Jesus in this passage, my hope and my prayer is that you will see that he is the person worth listening to, more than anybody or anything else. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to work with you through this, hopefully, to see three different groups who listen to themselves and see what that means and how that might look like us. And then what it looks like to listen to Jesus and why we should do that. 4 reasons that Jesus gives us to listen and be trusting him. And then we'll end with one final question. So listen to yourself in one sense and then listen to Jesus. Let's look at our passage. I'm going to try to show you three different groups that we find here in this passage who are busy listening to themselves and not listening to Jesus or really anybody else. The first group we find is in the first number of verses where we meet Jesus' brothers. Now, this is rather interesting. Jesus is the oldest in his family, and he has a number of other siblings. And here some of those brothers come to Jesus, and they begin to question him. John, the writer of this gospel, tells us they don't really believe in Jesus. They are actually here confronting Jesus because they've grown up with him. Jesus has left, in a sense, the carpentry business. Jesus has gone and started this ministry. He has disciples following him. He's teaching the people. And here's the brothers, and they're basically saying to Jesus, why don't you put on a show? Why are you walking around doing these things, but you're not really putting yourself out there for all the world to see? And so they challenge him. You can see this in the verses. Leave here and go to Judea. In other words, go to Jerusalem that your disciples also may see the works you're doing, for no one who works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. In other words, what they're saying is, you think you're a big deal, so why don't you go show the world you're a big deal? Why don't you go public, put on a big show, go prime time? You see, John says they don't really believe in him. They're asking him to do this not because they want to see it and be proved wrong, but because actually they want Jesus to go and show himself to the world and find out that he's not what he thinks he is. It's a rather remarkable thing that here they are, people who had grown up with Jesus, and they really don't know him. They don't get it. They sound a little bit like they're either jealous or even angry with Jesus. And Jesus' response to them is a rather remarkable and tough response in one sense, because in verse 6, it says this. Jesus says, my time is not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it, that its works are evil. You see, what Jesus is really saying, in a sense, to his brothers in this moment is he's saying, look, you guys want me to make a big deal. You want me to be the big show. You want me to go out there and be public. But fame is fleeting. Public opinion changes in a moment. I'm not here to win the crowd. I'm not here to win fame and fortune. I'm here for a different reason. And actually, when I speak to the crowd, when I speak to the people, they're going to turn on me. My job in this world right now is not to come and be popular, but it's to do the work that God has sent me to do. But Jesus' brothers don't believe in him. They don't see it. And I think this is a really important thing just to pause and think about. If you're, in a sense, like Jesus' brother, you're close, in a sense, to Jesus. You've been around Jesus. You've been growing up in the church, or you've been around church for maybe a large part of your life. You may be in a place where you're just like these brothers. You know about Jesus. You've been around Jesus, but you don't really believe in Jesus. And your attitude towards Jesus is, until you prove yourself to me with some big show, why should I listen to you? Until you are somebody in the world's eyes, why should I listen to you? It's really an attitude of condescension. It's an attitude of placing yourself above Jesus and saying, the only way I'll trust you is if you prove that you will do what I want, when I want, how I want it. Why don't you prove yourself to me? And that kind of pride does not lead you to Jesus. Now, the second group that we see in this passage is the Jewish religious leaders, and we see them mostly in verses 14 to 24. Jesus, after telling his brothers, and it's a little confusing, I know, that he won't go up publicly to the feast, does end up going privately, quietly. And then in the middle of the feast, because it was a week-long feast, Jesus goes in the temple and begins to teach. Verse 14. The response to this is one of kind of amazement and anger. The Jewish religious leaders and other people too are saying, how can Jesus be someone who can teach like this when he's never studied? Jesus hasn't studied with any of the rabbis of his day, any of the sort of the professors of his day who would have been people you had to go to in order to learn from before you could publicly teach. You should have gone to school. And Jesus hasn't done any of that because none of the rabbis, and they've all been consulted by this point, none of the rabbis say, oh yeah, we taught Jesus. No, he hasn't learned from any of them. And so they're basically questioning his credentials. They don't agree with what he's saying. They don't like what he's saying. And they're really calling him out as someone who has, in a sense, no right to be there. And further to that, as Jesus begins and continues to teach, Jesus knows that they're really looking for a way to quietly arrest him, put him on trial, and have him killed. Because they're that upset and angered by who Jesus is and what he's doing. And why are they so upset? Because Jesus points out their hypocrisy. Because Jesus points out the fact that they know all kinds of things about the law, and yet, as he says, none of them keep it. They seem to be willing to judge all kinds of things and think that they have the right to judge all kinds of people and things around them, and yet Jesus says, you're a bunch of hypocrites. That's what he's saying. And I think this is a warning. This is a warning that here you can know all kinds of things about God, you can know all things about the Bible even, and still miss Jesus. You can be religious, you can grow up in church, you can spend a lot of time doing all these kinds of things, going to studies, doing Bible studies even, and still miss Jesus. I mean, I remember a number of years ago, I can do this too. I was in a group of pastors and teachers, and we were all talking together and planning something together, and we were all talking about this new heavens and new earth that's to come. And we were saying, let's talk about what this would look like. And so as we teach this to a group of people that we are working towards teaching it to in a bit of a conference, we said, let's figure out all the things we want to know about the new heavens and new earth, and let's see if we can put them together, and we'll all take turns, and we'll teach all this stuff. And we had this whole big plan, and we talked for quite a long time. And all of a sudden, somebody says this, hold on a minute. I think we're missing something. And I remember thinking to myself, what are we missing? We've covered a lot of stuff here. Like, man, we look at all the passages, we look at all this stuff, we got a good plan, everything else. And I thought, I wonder what this person's going to say. I really didn't know. And this person said, we've talked this whole time about the new heavens, new earth, about resurrected bodies, about living in this new heavens and new earth, about working and serving God in this new heavens and new earth, about doing all these things, about having everybody healed and restored and no more death and no more dying and no more crying and all these wonderful things. It's true. All of it's true. But in all this time, we've never once talked about Jesus. We're in the new heavens and new earth doing all these things, and we don't even talk about Jesus? What is wrong? There is something wrong here. And I remember that hit me like a ton of bricks. It's like, yeah, you can know all this theology, you can know all these things, you can study all this stuff, but in the end, if you don't really have Jesus, what does it matter? If Jesus is missing, then you're missing everything. And so these Jewish religious leaders sound off a warning for us that you can know and learn all kinds of things, but if in the end you don't have Jesus and you're missing Jesus, then you are in a terrible, terrible place. Now, the third group that we look at here, people who listen to themselves and are not listening to Jesus, is the crowd. And as every crowd is, the crowd is a mixed bag. Let me show you a few different places the crowd comes up. First, verse 12. Jesus comes, he hasn't been shown yet publicly in Jerusalem, but the crowd's gathered in Jerusalem for the feast. And here's in verse 12 what the crowd is saying. The many are muttering about him, which is interesting. That's how crowds work. They mutter and they sort of grumble together. Find someone who agrees with you and argue with the people who don't. That's how crowds work. And then some say he's a good man. Others say, no, he's leading the people astray. And you could just see, isn't this just how our world works, right? Polarized. I think he's actually pretty good. No, he's not. He's leading us astray. I think he's telling us the truth. Oh, no, he's lying. And there it goes, back and forth. Yes, no, back and forth. This is the crowd. And then the crowd actually doesn't just say that, but when Jesus is interacting with the Jewish leaders, they're listening in. And we find out in verse 19 that Jesus says to the religious leaders, why do you seek to kill me? In other words, I know what you're up to. I know that you don't like me. And here's what the crowd says as Jesus says that to the religious leaders. Verse 20, you have a demon. Who is trying to kill you? Now, in our terms today, if we might put it in how people might respond today, they would say, you're crazy. You've lost your mind. This is the crowd, right? Jesus is speaking. They hear him teaching. It makes lots of sense to them. They're like, wow, how do you get this kind of learning? And then a moment later, as Jesus says something, they respond with, are you nuts? Are you crazy? You're crazy. That's the crowd. And then later on, as we look through this passage, we see another instance in which the crowd shows us kind of what the crowd is like. And we see this in verses 25 to 27. Because here in verses 25 to 27, we learn something about what the people thought of the coming Messiah or the Christ, the anointed one. Now, just to make sure you understand what we're talking about here, the people here are saying Jesus can't be the special king, the Messiah, the anointed one, the Christ. That's what all means the same. Messiah, Christ, just two different languages for the same word that means anointed. It means the special king who is to come. They saw the special king who was to come as one who would save them from the Romans and bring peace in that way and prosperity. But they basically had been taught by some of the rabbis in that day that whoever this anointed one, this Messiah would be, he would appear in a sense out of nowhere. And no one would know where he came from. You wouldn't have known where he was from. And so people, as they were talking about whether Jesus could be this Messiah, were arguing and saying he can't be the Messiah because we know where he's from. We know he grew up in Nazareth. We know that he's spending his time right now in Capernaum. Because we know where he's from, he can't be this Messiah because the Messiah is supposed to appear out of nowhere. And this again is just like the crowd. You don't really know what you're talking about when you're in the crowd. The crowd decides it's going to be one thing one day and one thing the next day. They can turn in the middle of a day, in the middle of a moment. You see, the typical thing about any crowd is that usually it's the loudest voices who win for the time being, until the next loudest voice chimes in. And if you live your life following the crowd, following the loudest voices, being swept along by the latest things you hear and not thinking through them or challenging them, you will be swept away just like the crowd. And often what will happen is you will miss the most important things. You see, whether you're close to Jesus like his brothers and miss it, whether you are studying theology and you're religious and missing Jesus, or whether you're part of the crowd and think you know better and you get swept along with it and again miss Jesus, in every single situation in this passage, the people miss who Jesus is. They're not listening to him. They're not trusting him as the true source. They're looking ultimately really to themselves. And when you look to yourself, you are left with the best possible answer for how you can find true meaning and purpose and understanding in life to be found only in yourself. And I'm telling you, it is the biggest dead end there was then and it is today. So, why listen to Jesus? Why not listen to yourself? Well, I think there's lots of reasons in this passage we should and ought to listen to Jesus. And it's because we see who Jesus really is and what he is like. And seeing who Jesus really is like, that is the most compelling reason to trust him, to listen to him more than anybody else. And so let's look at 4 different reasons we see in this passage of why listening to Jesus is best for you. The first one is this. The first compelling reason to listen to Jesus, and I want you to stick with me because this is a bit hard to understand maybe at first. It's going to be counterintuitive, okay? But the first big reason to listen to Jesus is that Jesus at times will tell you things you don't want to hear. That Jesus is the one person who will speak the truth in love, truths that we don't want to hear, that we don't want to be listening to. And he does it because he loves us. And we see him doing it in this passage. A number of examples. Verse 7, talking to his own brothers, he says to them, the world cannot hate you, but it hates me because what? I testify about it that its works are evil. Jesus could have kept in one sense, if you want to put it in a human sense like we would, Jesus could see the evil around him, could see the evil in people's hearts and lives, and he could have just said, I'm not going to say anything. But he speaks the truth in love, and he testifies, he points it out, not in some hypocritical way, but in a loving, gracious way, and he's doing it because we need to see it. You know, if you don't have anybody in your life who can speak this kind of truth into your life, if you don't have, in a sense, a time where God by his Spirit convicts you of things in your life, you're like, oh man, that is me, then you are blind. And one of the worst places you could be in life is to have nobody close enough to you, who you let get close enough to you, that God can use in your life to speak the truth in love, graciously, but to speak the truth so that there's areas in all of our lives, mine included, that need to change and need to be exposed. And it only happens when someone loves you enough to speak that truth in love to you. And Jesus is somebody who does this. He does it by his Spirit through the word when you read it. And he does it with other people around you who can speak these truths into your heart and into your life. Why? Because they love you. Because Jesus loves you. And so one of the most compelling reasons, the first big reason that we need to see of why we should listen to Jesus is because he loves us enough to show us the places in our life where we are evil, where we need to be forgiven, where we need to be changed. And we all desperately need it. The second reason that we should listen to Jesus, why he's the best person to listen to, we see in verses 15 to 18. And basically here, the Jewish religious leaders are challenging Jesus on his credentials. And they're saying, how could you be teaching when you've never learned? And I don't know, sometimes I think about these kind of passages and I think, what would I have done if I was challenged that way? Like, what if I was Jesus, And they say, who are you to teach us? I think my natural reaction if I was Jesus would have been, I'm God. I know everything. What are you talking about? You should listen to me. That's what's in me. But what does Jesus say? He basically says, he doesn't claim his own authority. He basically says, I'm here speaking on behalf of the one who sent me. And my job, says Jesus here, my desire right now is not to seek my own glory, but the glory of the person who sent me. This is like, no one does this. We don't do this. Jesus, in a sense, is saying, even though he has every right to say, I know everything, I'm God, you should listen to me. He's saying, look, I'm come here on a mission from God the Father, and my desire is not to bring glory to myself or to make a big deal about myself, but my desire is for you to see my Father and experience his glory. I want him to get the credit and the glory. I want you to notice him. Don't notice me right now. Look at the Father. This is not how we operate. I know it's in me, and maybe it's in you too, that when we get a chance for any kind of stepping into the limelight or get some credit, especially when we don't get credit for what we want, we complain and we do all kinds of things, but we rarely say, I want it to be for someone else's glory. I want it to be that someone else gets the credit. I want God to get the credit. I want somebody else to get the credit. We're not humble like this. And I think one of the most compelling reasons to listen to Jesus is that he acts like no one else does. When given the opportunity, in a sense, to promote himself, he doesn't. He seeks the glory of his Father in heaven. It's worth listening to someone this humble. It's worth trusting someone who acts this way, not in some false humility way, but in a true, humble, not self-seeking glory, but glory-giving way. Wow. What an amazing person Jesus is. Now, the third compelling reason to listen to Jesus and why it's best to listen to him, we see in verse 23. And Jesus has been interacting with the religious leaders here, and they're upset with him. And here's why. He tells them, this is the story. Jesus has healed a person on the Sabbath day. And in the religious leaders' minds, that means he broke the Sabbath. He worked on the Sabbath. And Jesus confronts them in their hypocrisy and says, you will circumcise someone on the Sabbath day, which it technically should be considered work too, but you're okay with that. But you're angry at me because I healed a whole person's body. Wow, that's hypocrisy on display. But what's amazing about Jesus here is that they miss the whole fact that he's the one who heals. He's the one who restores. That Jesus is actually someone who comes into this world, and despite all the opposition and all the difficulties and everybody else not believing in him and denying him and everything else, he still comes and he restores people. He heals people. He brings new life. And this is what you see in Jesus over and over again. And his miracles and his healings are not, again, so that he can pad his resume and make himself look good in that sense, but he's doing it as a preview of the fact that his mission is to bring new life. That these restorations, these healings, these miracles are not magic shows. They're not meant to just impress you with power, but they're meant to be a preview of what Jesus is all about: restoration, new life. And when you see someone who has the kind of power that Jesus has, and he uses it for these reasons, then you see someone who's, again, unlike anybody else in this world. Because everybody else who has power, if they had this kind of power, you know what they would do? Monetize it. I'm going to sell this power. I'm going to sell these healings. I'm going to sell this restoration. I'm going to make some money, and I'm going to make some money for the people around me, and it's happening all over the place. This is one of the true critiques of some people within the church. That we take this healing and miraculous power of God and we begin to monetize it and make it about us and about business and about fame and everything else. And here's Jesus, who has the ultimate power himself. And what does he do? He uses it to restore, not to gain fame, not to gain advantage, and not to gain wealth. There's no one who acts like this but Jesus. Using his power for good, restoring the weak, the downcast, the outcast. That's Jesus. Another reason to listen to him. And so we've seen Jesus is willing to speak these hard truths in our lives that we need to hear. Jesus is willing to be the one who comes down and teaches us amazing things and yet give glory to God and not be self-seeking in his glory, but be humble. And we see Jesus be somebody who's willing to use his power to restore and give new life. And the final reason to listen to Jesus is amazing, but it's a little bit hard maybe at first to see. And let me show it to you. And that's that Jesus came to save. You say, what do I mean? Well, there's a recurring phrase in our passage. I want to point it out to you. The first occurrence of it is in verse 6. Jesus says this to his brothers: my time has not yet come. My time has not yet come, but your time is always here, but my time has not yet come. Then in verse 8, he says this again: you go up to the feast. I am not going up to the feast, for my time has not yet fully come. And then further down in verse 30, near the end of our passage today, says this: so they were, that's the Jewish leaders, were seeking to arrest Jesus, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. This phrase, which happens 3 times in our passage and happens actually other times in the Gospel of John, is the exact same phrase that's said over and over again, speaking of a time, an hour that is coming. And the time and the hour that's coming, that's referred to over and over again, is the time, the hour of Jesus' suffering and his death. You see, what Jesus is saying to them in this phrase over and over again is he's saying, look, I'm doing what I need to do right now, but the time, the hour is coming when I am going to suffer and I'm going to die. And Jesus is going to suffer and he's going to die for the very same people who don't believe in him in this passage. His brothers who don't believe in him, he's going to suffer and die for them. The Jewish religious leaders who want to arrest him, to kill him, and seek to end his life are the very kind of people that Jesus also suffers and dies for. The crowd who one day sings his praise and he's popular, the next day desert him and walk away from him. The crowd, the one day who says he's a good teacher, the next day they call him a demon and a liar. The fickle crowd are the people, the kinds of people that Jesus suffers and dies for. Who does that? Who loves people who don't love them? Who loves people who hate them? Who loves people who reject and deny them? Who loves people who don't believe in them? We don't do that. Jesus does. He's the only one. He sees people like his family, the crowd, his disciples who desert him, the religious leaders who call out for his death, and he suffers and he dies for people like that. for people like you and me. The most compelling reason to listen to Jesus is that he's the one who sees us as his enemies and still comes and suffers and dies in our place. No one in this world will love you that deeply, that much. No one even comes close. And when you see all these different things about who Jesus is, these are the most and these are the compelling reasons to listen to him. That if this is who he is and what he's like and how he loves you, how could you not listen to him? Because that's the final question for all of us today that we need to wrestle with. Who are you listening to? In your everyday life, not just Sunday mornings, but every day, who are you listening to? Who is it that has your ear? Who are you trusting for the most important answers in life? Who are you looking to for the wisdom that you need? Who are you counting on to love you and care for you and speak words that you need to hear? Jesus is the one, the only one. And as you listen to him, he uses his power, he's proven his love to change and to make you into a new person. Someone who will listen to him and follow him every day, enjoying him, delighting in him, and loving him back because of his great love that he's first shown you. Let's pray. Father, I pray that for those who we're convicted, we're sitting here and we're like, I don't listen to Jesus. I've been listening to myself, I've been listening to the world around me, I've been listening to the crowd, I've been listening to religious authorities of some sort or another. I've been listening to everybody but Jesus. I'd help us to see how beautiful it is that the person we should be listening to is the person who loves us more than anybody else does. And help us to see how great your love for us is in Jesus so that we would be listening to Jesus. And Father, for those who are listening right now and our hearts are hard, we're like, I don't know about this. I don't know if I should listen to Jesus. I'd rather listen to myself. I pray that you would do the most loving thing you could ever do. You would just show us how much of a dead end that kind of thinking is. Expose it in us, whether we're here growing up in the church or been in church all our lives, or whether we have very little experience with you at all. I pray that you would be so loving as to expose how far from you we are if we're not listening to you. And by your love and your grace, open our eyes by your Spirit's power so that we would be drawn to Jesus and listening to him. I pray that you do that work by your Spirit for your glory. And we know that would be for our good. In Jesus' name, amen.